My name is David Nash. I'm the director of the Legal One program. I'm very happy to be here with Barbara Gantwerk. Barbara is the director of special projects for the Foundation for Educational Administration, and Barbara is the former director of special education for the New Jersey Department of Education. Barbara also previously served as the assistant commissioner for the New Jersey Department of Education. So Barbara, thank you so much for being with me.
It's my pleasure to be here.
We're going to be discussing today the issue of bullying and students with disabilities and some of the special considerations that come into play when we're thinking how to best address bullying issues related to students with disabilities. So Barbara, appreciate the opportunity to discuss this really important issue with you.
Yeah, this is a very important topic, and I'm glad that you invited me to talk about it today.
Great.
I tried to think about some of the important information that people need to think about when we're dealing with students with disabilities. One, we know that students with disabilities are at greater risk for bullying and are more likely to be bullied than their non-disabled peers. We also know that bullying for anybody can lead to academic problems, but for students with disabilities who are already dealing with academic challenges, this can even be more of a problem, heightened. That for students with disabilities, self-advocacy is important and peer intervention. Self-advocacy for students to be able to speak about their disabilities, understand their disabilities, talk with others, and peer intervention. And one of the reasons that's so important is that we know that for all students, that students who are rejected by their peers, students who are lonely, who have no social groups, are more likely to be victims of bullying. So students with disabilities certainly are experiencing the lack of a social peer group, more often are lonely, and therefore there again, it's another reason why they are more at risk for bullying because of that. So dealing with it leads us to think about things like interventions that have to do with peers and social interaction. Students with limited cognitive skills or students with limited social skills, they may not even know what bullying is. They may not be able to understand it. And so students who have poor social skills, lack of friends, lack of peers, may sometimes be more willing to do whatever is asked of them because they want to have friends, because they want to be with other kids. So there's so many things involved when we talk about it, so many differences. While that's true for all students, it's even more pronounced sometimes for students with disabilities. And while students with disabilities are more likely the victim, they can also be the perpetrators as well.
Sure.
Especially students with emotional and behavioral difficulties. So another interesting thing is that students are more likely to be victims of bullying in separate settings.
And sometimes parents feel like that is the safer setting because you have specialized programs and instruction and staff.
Right.
But it can be a heightened risk.
And sometimes it's absolutely correct that it can be. But it's interesting that sometimes when you have students who all have emotional and behavioral problems, there's more bullying, there's more fighting, there's more problems. And so in those situations, they have found sometimes students with disabilities are at greater risk than you would expect.
So it's interesting that you mentioned this issue about self-advocacy. It sounds like there is a danger that we may have some situations where there's under-reporting of students with disabilities who may be victims because they might not understand that they are being victimized. How do we address that issue to make sure that we're not missing any potential bullying?
Well, I think one of the important points that we're going to get to is that we need to educate, right? We know that there's education going on in schools all the time to understand what is bullying, to identify it, to know what to do when you're being bullied, when you see someone else being bullied, aside from how to not be the bully ever or not to engage in those kinds of behaviors. So when we think about educating, we run programs for students. How do we make sure that students with disabilities all have access to those programs? And by access, I mean the content level. Do they understand it? The method of instruction. You know, there are various ways that could make that information more difficult, especially for students maybe with cognitive disabilities, learning disabilities. How are we presenting the material? So in terms of education, we want teachers to be thinking about, how do I make this material accessible to all of the students? So you want students to understand, you want them to have a vocabulary to use, a vocabulary that identifies the varying kinds of bullying. What is bullying? You know, what are the different forms that it could take? And do I have words for that? We want students to, again, be able to verbalize and talk about, what do I do if I see it? If it's happening to me, who do I go to? Who do I call? Well, we want to make sure that the students with disabilities, they may need different types of instruction for that, just like they might for anything else because of whatever learning disabilities. So they might need more repetition. They might need the content being done in a different way. They may need to have more scenarios. They may need more opportunities to practice. Those are things all students need. But we need to think about what various ways do we ensure that the students with disabilities are really getting this information. How do we make sure that students with cognitive disabilities have a way to describe when something's wrong and happening that it's wrong, and how do they have a mechanism for asking for help? What do we do with students who are nonverbal? How do we give them an alternate mechanism to make sure that they know how they can express that, who they should go to? So that's a very important part, the educational component.
So when you're developing an IEP for a student with a disability, you really want to make sure you're thinking through these issues. I think at times we are so understandably focused on academic content and making sure that a student is, you know, acquiring that we might not give the attention that we have to social and emotional learning and character development.
Right, and child study teams know how critical it is, social skills and social and emotional learning, because making students available for learning is a key issue, and how students feel and how they deal with social situations. More and more, I think schools are looking at a student who doesn't have the social skills, hasn't learned them automatically the way most children do, or at least a lot of children do. How do we actually teach those social skills, those behavioral skills? And so that's what a lot of the programs that are dealing with bullying, harassment, intimidation are really focusing very directly on those social skills. And in the IEP, we should be looking at it. Some of this may relate back to the academics. In other words, how a child is going to learn in that program that you're implementing in the class may be similar to how that child's learning other academics. What are the modifications and accommodations? What do I need to think about in how I present the material, how I ask the student to practice that material? So it's all related, and the IEP really should be looking at all of those things. A key here is this issue of students with disabilities having very limited social networks and peer groups, which causes them to be more vulnerable on many levels. And we have to think about then the interventions for that deal with social skills and peer groups. So a lot of the programs that schools are implementing now, I mean, it could be unified sports, which deals more with than sports, but groups, to have inclusive groups, having peers work with kids, whether it's lunch buddies, whether it's peer groups, you know, whatever you want to call it or do, it all entails having kids be together, less lonely, having support, social groups. And it's interesting that they have found that, and this goes back to advocacy as well as the social interactions, but when people see the behavior, let's say it's inappropriate behavior of some kind, and they attribute it to a person's something that they can't help. They attribute it to a disability, or they attribute it to some problem. They're more likely to help than be sort of inappropriate, let's say.
Yes.
So having students with disabilities be able to understand what their disability is, be able to express it, be able to explain it, helps other people in understanding what it's all about.
So there are some potential obstacles to work through there. Some parents are understandably very concerned with keeping information confidential about their child's disability.
Right. All of these things would be done with families together, talking about what the needs of the individual student, and it's how the student feels. Some students are very comfortable giving a presentation on what it is that they struggle with and how other people can help, and other students wouldn't do that and wouldn't feel comfortable. So there's no one answer to everything, but these are basically things to think about, trying to understand, is this student lonely, alone? Are they sitting alone all the time? Do they have any social life? There's another interesting fact that when a high social status student initiates some contact with a student with a disability, or another student, that student that they've initiated, it has an impact on their behavior as well as other people around them.
It's a signal.
It's a signal. And so many of the programs that schools are trying to create are to get kids together and to make that happen. It would be nice when it happens naturally, but hopefully if we encourage it and we build it, it then moves on to become a more natural thing. But it has to do with lessening that isolation, which is a problem for not just students with disability, but a little heightened because they have less means to cope with it.
So there are situations where parents have come to administrators and teachers and said, my child doesn't have a lot of friends in school. Can't you make these other students socialize with my child and make sure that my child has friends? How do we respond to that concern?
Well, that's a difficult question.
Sure.
So we try in schools to encourage that to happen in ways through the activities we do, through providing ways to see how they can get together. And sometimes it's coordinated. It's a lunch buddy program, it's a peer program, it's a, there are many different kinds of programs. The Unified Sports has lots of different clubs where people can get together. Circle of Friends was one of the oldest programs that I am familiar with. For students with severe disabilities were coming into schools, and the schools would create a group of students who said, we'll get together and we'll help. I'll make sure the student can get to their first class. I'll, have lunch with the student. Now, you don't want all the time to be planning everything and having it, unnatural.
But it looks to me like what you're doing is planting some seeds.
Exactly. You're trying to develop situations that can then become more normalized.
Yes.
And I think it's true for students with disabilities, but it's also true for all students. I think teachers are and should be sensitive to that student who's by themselves all the time and can't figure out a way to connect. We try to help to find something that the student likes to do, or someone who might like the same things. We can't organize everything, we can't ensure everything, but we can think about that all the time in terms of what we're doing in schools to promote that.
Is it reasonable to build into the goals that we have for students that we want to show some goals that allow us to see the student is engaged with the school community, is involved in some way in that school community?
I think it's whether it's an IP goal or it's just a goal we have for all students.
Sure. That
we think about, how do we measure the students' involvement? We know that the more students are involved, the more likely they are to graduate, let alone go on to things.
Sure.
So we know that for all students, so we certainly should be looking at students with disabilities, and when we're looking at their IP, we're looking at recreational activities, we're looking at what they enjoy, we're looking at their interests and abilities, and trying to build all that to support the student. We're not just looking at, academics in a vacuum.
Sure. So let's think through the situation where we have a student with a disability who has been the victim of bullying. It's occurred, perhaps there was an upsetting situation, maybe it was something that went on for some period of time. What are the considerations that we should work through in thinking through how to support that student?
Well, I think first we're saying we've done an investigation and we know.
We know the student was victimized, and now we have to think through how do we help this student deal with the fact that they've gone through this.
So we're going to look at exactly what happened, what was the nature of the relationship of the student, how often do they have to be together, how are we making them safe? Our first thing is
Sure.
making sure that that student is safe. We're making sure that whatever happened is not going to happen again. We're looking at whatever we have to do to ensure
Excellent.
that. And then we're looking at what strengths we can build in the student, make sure the student knows how to deal with this, if it should happen again, and where they go, and alternative social behaviors. And it would depend, every student would be different. You'd be
course.
looking at the IP, you'd be talking with the case manager, you'd be trying to see what the nature of that behavior was, what was it, and how can we avoid it again, and how can we build on the pro-social behavior experiences for that student.
And yet, and one of the systems that's built in to make sure we don't miss anything is the idea of reconvening the IEP team for that student to assess, is there something different we need to do in the IEP given what the student has gone through?
Right, and I think you may have to do that, but again, it's an individual decision. It's based on the nature, the severity, the likelihood of it happening again, the likelihood of there being something that you want to change. I mean, you could talk about big things like program, but you know, it doesn't have to be for every student. I think it is an individual decision whether or not you want to make some changes in the IEP, but you certainly can.
And in many cases, we won't need to. I think that's absolutely true. But remember, the U.S. Department of Education did put out guidance a couple of years ago that we should at least convene the team and have the discussion.
That's right.
And it's a nice check and balance.
You may not need to change anything.
Yes.
I think that's the point, that's individual.
Absolutely.
You may not need to change anything, you may need to change something.
That's right, that's right. So what about the other side of the equation? You have a student with a disability who perhaps has done something that was harmful to another student.
Right.
And perhaps it is a manifestation of that student's disability.
Students with disabilities can be the victim, they can also be the perpetrator. They can be both, as all students can be both. So I think the investigation is looking into it. To me, we have to think about what happened. You can think of simple examples. Let's say it's a student with Tourette's, and the student is blurting out things that one would say are very inappropriate and constitute harassment to another student. If we assume that legally they must call that bullying, what we do about it has to be based on the circumstances that occur. Because what we do is supposed to be instructive. It's not that we are required to impose drastic punishment.
That's right.
It's that we're to impose instructional change. We want to do something to help the student learn different behavior, more pro-social behavior, and it would make no sense to impose some harsh punitive action on a student who had no control over what had happened, that it really was a manifestation of their disability. So we have to be able to step back, use common sense in how we deal with it. A student who did not have perhaps the cognitive ability to understand the behavior. Let's say they were told to do something and they did it, they wanted to be friends, and we actually, the team and everyone, believed that it was not, the student really didn't have the knowledge of what they were doing. Again, we would think about what are the ways that we can help the student learn what it was, learn how not to do it, what are the pro-social behaviors. So again, the word discipline means to teach. It doesn't mean to punish necessarily. So what we impose should be something that promotes the kind of behavior that we want to see in a school. Sometimes we do impose the same penalties or whatever for other students, and that's appropriate too. But I think what we're always trying to think about is what makes sense to move us forward to learning what to do given whatever the situation. But I think given your question, it's that you have to think about
Yes.
what is the nature of this, what is the student's disability. Doesn't mean behavior is always manifestation of the disability. It can have nothing to do with it, but sometimes it does, and I think we have to really think about it.
And what our courts have said over and over again when it comes to bullying is that your response needs to be reasonably calculated to end the harassment. So if you're doing things that don't in any way influence the student's behavior, how would that be justifiable? So you certainly need to think practically about what will work, what will make a difference.
Right.
And along those lines too, the example you gave I think is a great way to think about how it might be useful for a parent of a student with a disability to allow you to share some information about that disability. If other students understood this was a student, for example, with Tourette's, and the student did say something, there would be that understanding and the student might not feel as if they were victimized.
Right. I think that goes along with the idea that when other people understand the disability or what happens, or that it's not something deliberate, they're more likely to help rather than to respond in a very negative way. So the more students with disabilities learn to advocate for themselves, to be able to speak about it to the extent they want to and can, but I think we want to help kids become self-advocates. We want them to be able to understand themselves what their disability is. It's important for them to understand what the issues are and to be able to describe it at appropriate times and in an appropriate setting. So that's part of this whole issue.
In many cases, parents feel like the solution may be that we have to have an aide who is with that student all day in order to monitor that student. And in some cases that might be appropriate, but I would imagine in many cases you want that student to learn to advocate for himself or herself.
Yes, and I think our issue with that is we want students with disabilities to learn independence,
Yes.
and we want them to have choice. And those are things that typical kids are getting. So oftentimes if you just have a person with them, they don't learn the kinds of independence that they need. They don't get to exert the kind of choice that they need in order to make decisions. To make good decisions, you have to choose.
That's
You
right.
have to weigh what I do, what I don't do. So I think that the answer of putting a person with you all day is not necessarily one that's going to foster independence and choice. And what we don't want is children, one, over-reliant on someone else to prompt them and tell them what to do. And also, we want students to have direct interaction with their peers.
Absolutely. So let's think a little bit about how we get to the truth when there is an allegation of bullying, and you're questioning a student, perhaps who was a witness to a bullying incident, and the student happens to have a disability. What sort of issues should we think through when we are talking with that student?
Well, of course, that depends on the student, because for many students, you'll deal with them like any other student. I mean, a student who may have, dyslexia, it doesn't mean you're going to have to deal with them totally different unless you're giving them something to read or something like that.
Or asking a student to write something, you may need to understand that.
Right, but I'm saying that for many students with disabilities, you would be interacting the way you would. On the other hand, there are some students who we know have different ways of communicating. And so we have to take it just like you would a language barrier. You wouldn't speak to a child who didn't speak English, so you would obviously, the more obvious ones, you would have a signer.
Yes.
You know, if the student used sign language, you would think about what are the particular needs of that student, and do they in any way interfere with this investigation? I would think if you're doing one, you would check with the case manager up front. You would just find out what are the issues that I need to be aware of with this student. Is this an overly anxious student? What could I do is there a certain person who might make this student more comfortable in a setting where they're investigating? Do I have to be very, very clear and how I have to ask my questions in a certain in a certain way? What's the language ability of this student?
Sure.
So I think it's really taking a look at who the student is and finding out if there are specific things that I need to know about with this student. And while that's the case for all kids, it's more challenging sometimes here because you may have something in the actual method that you're asking them to respond or that you're engaging with them. And that's why I think it's important when we talked about education that students need a vocabulary. They need a vocabulary to talk about these kinds of incidents. And that's what we do when we do education on bullying and harassment and intimidation. We give them scenarios, we give them vocabulary to talk about so that when they're going to talk with us, if they ever have to, they already have a vocabulary which helps them with pro-social behavior and things, but
That's right.
also in this instance.
Absolutely. I mean, in many cases, of course, the anti-bullying specialist is a counselor and is very sensitive and would be attuned to being careful on those issues. But you know, sometimes we're overwhelmed with a lot of different things coming at us at once. So I do think it's important that we have as a normal practice that we touch base with the case manager. Yeah. And if you do that every time, you'll make sure nothing falls through the cracks. So are there other issues you want to make sure we touch base on regarding students with disabilities? Any considerations that we haven't addressed?
I think we've addressed,
Sure.
I mean, there's probably a lot that I didn't think of, but
Sure.
I think we addressed a lot. I think another big issue is the same for all kids, is the reticence to speak about it.
Yes.
Is the fear that it will get worse, no one will do anything about it, for those who are very clear about what happened. And so that's part of the importance of the educational programs, to let students know they can speak,
Yes.
who they can speak with, and to know that the primary issue is to make all students feel safe.
Yeah, and there is that tremendous fear that some kids have about retaliation and the fact that
Right.
we're not convinced that you as the adults can protect us.
Right. And I think that's true for families of students with disabilities. One of the biggest fears of families with disabilities when they send their child off to school is, will they be safe?
Yes.
Will people treat them well? You know, and so making it clear that that is something that is primary importance, and letting parents know immediately that our goal, and we will make sure your child is safe, because that is a huge fear. I know for all parents. So,
of course.
but for parents with disabilities, especially with children who can't speak, who can't report back to you, who can't describe what happened, or children who have behavior that calls a lot of attention to themselves and causes a lot of this isolation, that's a very big issue, and we need to recognize and bring families into this to know how seriously we take it and how we recognize that issue for them.
And I would imagine that families can also be incredibly helpful, because they will see signs that we don't see at times.
Right.
They'll see when their child comes home, the child acting in a very different way.
Right. You're right, and that brings out the important point of being in touch with families to let them know what the school does about this, so that they can talk to their students, so they know who they can call if they see one of these signs that concerns them, so that parents know right away, who do I call? Now, they can call their case manager. It's a student with disabilities, but I think it's very good for parents to feel that the school is on top of this.
And responsive when
Yeah.
the parent does make that phone call.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you for taking some time to talk with me. It's been incredibly helpful to address many of these issues. We are providing, as part of this online course, a link to helpful resource documents. So many of the topics that we talked about today, we'll make sure that we include resource documents to help guide folks to some best practices that are out there.
Wonderful. And I thank you for the opportunity to talk about this really important topic.
Great. Thank you, Barbara.
You're welcome, David.
And that will do it for this discussion regarding harassment, intimidation, and bullying for students with disabilities, and some important considerations that we should all have when we're working to ensure the health and safety of all of our students.